Okay, so in this conference, I'm going to talk to you about the three remaining cardinal virtues: justice, fortitude, and temperance. Justice is the habit by which we render to each person what is due to them. It's just a sense of everyone's got something that is due to them, And so in some way there's something very objective about justice. It's not as subjective as a lot of the other virtues like temperance and fortitude. It's more objective. It's just kind of what's due to that person, and do I habitually render to each person or give to each person what's due to them, In other words, justice is about establishing right order among persons, making sure there's a right order among persons, And that can happen at different levels. A simple way that can happen is in financial exchanges. I buy something, presumably the thing that you sell me is worth the amount of money I give you, right? A very simple, exchange like that. That's right order there, But not only in monetary things or in things that can be measured in terms of money, but also other things we need to render to people what is due to them. For example, we need to render honor to our parents, right? So if we have parents, we have to honor them. If we have civil authorities, we should honor them, right? If there's ecclesiastical authorities, we honor them. So we have to render the honor and respect that's due to each person. And everyone, insofar as they're a child of God, we have to render to them the dignity and respect of being a child of God. You see that? And then also there are other things, like in a family. What do you promise that you're in your wedding vows? To love you and honor you all the days of your life. So what's due to your wife? Love. You're not only honor, but love. You have to render what's due to your wife. She has to render what's due to you, right? And the marriage vow itself. Okay, here's something. This is a really interesting thing. When I talk to people who are in their 70s or older, and I ask them, exactly what did you promise when you got married? They usually know the right answer to that. But when I talk to people who are, in their 60s and younger, what did you promise? They almost always give me a wrong or an incomplete answer. Most people say something like this: I got married, and I say to them, David and Jonathan made a promise to love each other, right? Two men can promise to romantically love each other, or two women, right? Well, we promised to raise children together and live together. Well, no, actually, you could have a brother and sister whose sibling died, leaving their children orphans, and the brother and sister could promise to live together and raise those children together. They wouldn't be married. So living together, loving each other, none of those things actually makes you married. Do you know the exact content of your marriage vow? And most people will be almost surprised to hear this, but when they hear it, they're like, yeah, that's actually it. You promise to give each other the exclusive right over one another's bodies for the acts that are apt to generate children. It's exactly when you say, I take you to be my wife, you're saying to that woman, you have the right, and only you have the right, for the kinds of acts that generate children. And she says, I take you to be my husband. You have the right, and only you have the right, for the kind of acts that are apt to generate children. That is what makes you married. Loving each other won't make you married. Living together, raising children together, none of those things will make you married. Now, if you've given to each other that right for the acts that are apt to generate children, you better love each other, you better live together, you better raise your children together. Those are all effects of that. But a lot of people have missed the central part of marriage, and that's part of justice. A lot of people don't know that, okay? Now, a lot of you, your wives have gone through menopause. And so if your wife doesn't know that, it might be difficult for you at home, right? As a priest, I'm constantly kind of counseling couples. You've gone through menopause, your husband doesn't do that, sort of thing. So it's important for wives to know that, right? For example. So there's another example of a debt owed in justice that a lot of people don't even think about, right? With regard, in the the writings of St. Thomas, they just refer to it as a marriage debt, right? Like, what is he talking about? They went into debt because they got married? No, they're referring to the what's due in justice with regard to marital relations. So there's many different ways in which people exercise justice, and they give to the other what is due to them, by way of justice. There are two kinds of justice. One of them is called, for lack of a better term, distributive justice. And I'll give you a simple example of this. So let's say these three men here in the front, right here, let's say they all decided to invest in a company, right? And this man gave 50% of the capital, and he gave 30% of the capital, and he gave 20% of the capital. And now the company makes profits. What's just? Is it just if each of them gets an equal amount of the profits back? No, that's not just. What's just is he gets 50% of the profits, he gets 30% of the profits, he gets 20% of the profits. Do you see that? That's distributive justice. In other words, where you distribute to each person what's proportional to their contribution. Make sense? The same thing can happen, for example, in military matters, right? You've got a bunch of soldiers and they're fighting. Well, one soldier does something very heroic that the other soldiers didn't do. Should they all get the exact same honor for victory? No. The one who did the more heroic thing should get a higher honor. You see that? And so forth. So it's that kind of thing that's involved in distributive justice. Okay? Then you have what's called commutative justice, or just justice based on one-on-one exchanges. And that's the sort of thing I talked about before. For example, you are buying some product, right? You go to the store, you give them money, presumably they're giving you something that's worth the amount of money you give them. That's an exchange, and there what you're looking for is strict equality. Each person is giving to the other what they've received, but just in a different form. You see that? That's what's called commutative justice, where you're just exchanging like that one-on-one. Now, sometimes you have a kind of an interesting exchange between two persons, and it doesn't exactly fit. An example would be a parent and a child, right? What does a child owe to the parent, and what does a parent owe to the child? You see? There's a difference there. The child owes to the parent honor, respect, obedience. The parent owes to the child love and education and an upbringing. Does that make sense? So they're each rendering to each other what's due, but because of their difference in state of life, there's a different thing given each direction. Does that make sense? This is something, by the way, many of you, not most of you, have kids, and I often, as a priest, have to give counsel to young people, teenagers and things like that, who, not surprisingly, don't always have perfect parents. And so sometimes it comes up and they're telling me about, the problems they have at home and their mom or their dad or whatever's wrong with them. And I go through a little exercise with them. And I say, well, okay, let's talk about this. I want you to answer a few questions for me. Let's say someone really wealthy like Bill Gates gave you $10 billion. Would you be grateful? And they're like, oh yeah, Father, I'd be grateful for $10 billion. I'm like, well, what if Bill Gates happened to be a really bad guy? Would you stop being grateful? No, I think I'd still be grateful for the $10 billion. Maybe I'd even help him out a little bit and pray for him or something, because after all, he gave me $10 billion, right? And then I always ask them the question that makes them stop in their tracks. What would you rather have, $10 billion or your life? My life, Father. And who gave you that? My mom and dad. So often, it's the weirdest thing. People think that just because it's their parents, they're somehow excused from showing them honor because their parents have moral defects. My dad's an alcoholic. My mom's got these problems or that, The reason why you owe honor to your parents is not because they're good people. They're probably better than you suspect. There's a famous line by Mark Twain. Did you ever hear about that line from Mark Twain? He said, when I was 17, I thought my dad was an idiot. By the time I turned 25, I was surprised how much the old man had learned. So, but the foundation of the honor that a child owes a parent is because the parent gave them life. That's a foundation. And even if the parent turns out to be a spectacular failure in other respects, you still have to honor them in some way. I knew a case of a woman. She did not grow up Christian at all. She was some sort of pagan, and as a little child, her father had mental illness and terribly abused her when she was a little girl, you know. And obviously she couldn't keep on any kind of regular relationship, but as she grew up, she converted, became a Christian, eventually Catholic, and she realized that she had to learn how to forgive her dad. So she started writing him letters, but then he would write these nasty letters back about it's all her fault and whatever. I mean, she was a toddler, you know, but mentally ill guy, okay? So the guy failed spectacularly as a father. But she didn't give up. She said she realized, I still have to do something. So of course she kept praying for him, and she would just send him postcards without a return address, just saying, I love you, I'm praying for you, you know, here's how my life is going. And that's how she figured out how to give honor to her dad, even though he wasn't able to receive it well. Does that make sense? So that's a lesson for all of us. All of us, for certain, have parents, right? And whether they're alive or dead, we still have to honor them. And if we noticed, as we almost certainly did, defects in our parents, it's important in justice, right, to render honor to our parents because they gave us the greatest gift, more than $10 billion. They gave you a gift you'll never be able to repay. Huh? So, remember this as well when exchanging goods with someone. We have a tendency to exaggerate our own needs and minimize the needs of others. It's called original sin. Our Lord expressed it this way: why do you notice the splinter in your brother's eye and not the beam in your own? Right? We have a tendency to exaggerate our own needs and to minimize the needs of others. So what does real justice actually look like? It probably isn't what looks equal to you. It's probably more like you giving more than you think you should. And that's part of really realizing what true justice is, right? Very often, when you're trying to get a just settlement, you get a judge who's impartial. That's why judges have to recuse themselves if they have a conflict of interest. They can't be partial. They have to be someone who doesn't have a dog in the fight, who doesn't have any inclination one way or the other for either party, and then they settle the case, right? Precisely because we have a tendency to overemphasize our own needs and minimize the needs of others, huh? So that's why it's important to have impartiality. Well, if you don't have a judge to do that for you, what do? You compensate for that defect in your own inclinations, and when you're trying to give to another, try to give more than you think you're getting back, with regard to love with your spouse, with regard to honor and so forth, okay? Now, that brings me to another tangent, but it's apropos because you've got a room full of people, many of whom are married here, huh? I do a fair amount of marriage counseling, and when a couple has problems, the first meeting always goes the same way. The husband and wife come to me and they sit down, they say, our marriage is broken, it can't be fixed. I say, fine. And I send out the husband and I say to the wife, what's wrong with your marriage? I love my husband with all my heart, he doesn't love me back. Okay, fine, I send her out, bring in the husband. What's wrong with your marriage? I love my wife with all my heart, she doesn't love me back. So they're both swearing on a stack of Bibles they're the only one loving in the relationship. And I believe them both. Because what's happening is they're loving the other person, but in a way the other one can't feel. And love that can't be felt is no different than no love at all from their perspective. You see that? So there's really two problems that are happening in marriage very often. One is you're over-exaggerating your needs and minimizing the needs of your spouse, your wife. The other is that you're trying to love her, but not in a way she can feel. Okay? I'm going to give you a simple example, real-life example I've seen many times. Husband and wife date, they fall in love, they get engaged, everything's great. And you know what they both want from each other? A lot of time together, a lot of physical affection. That's what they want at the beginning of any relationship, any marriage, huh? Okay, now it's 6 or 7 years into the marriage, and now your wife has 2 or 3 kids, and they're little, and they're not rational, and you're looking at these children thinking to yourself, how am I going to provide for these kids? So off you go, spending more and more time at work so that you can make more money so you can provide for the kids. In the meantime, very often, your wife is left at home, a single parent for most of her children's waking hours. If she takes a 10-minute nap, one of her children might be dead when she wakes up. Literally, she can't do anything. She's just like, I have to just stay awake and watch these kids. No rational conversations, feral children running around, and no help. You know, a lot of people say to me, you know, in a traditional Catholic family, Dad works and Mom stays home. I say baloney. In a traditional Catholic family, Mom and Dad were both home on a farm or something, right? A blacksmith shop. You know what happened? The Industrial Revolution. In the mid-1800s, all the men went out to factories. Women became de facto single parents, and it was a very difficult situation for women. So what do they want to do? We want to get out of the house too. Now let's send someone else to take care of the kids while we both work, right? That's the typical thing that's happened in modern society, right? And I always say, like, with the information revolution, take advantage of the fact that there's possibilities for you to try and do some work from home. Try to get back in the home. The more natural situation is for Mom and Dad to be together at home with the kids as much as possible. That's the best situation for the kids, huh? If it's possible. I know it's not always possible. I get it. I'm just telling you what's the ideal to aim for, huh? In any case, in this scenario that I just described, husband comes home, beat down by the world. He really wants a lot of support and affection from his wife. And so he goes and, tries to smoochy. And she's like, this is how we got here in the first place, and you're ruining my figure. Go away. So you feel like, I worked all that time for my wife, and she doesn't appreciate me. She doesn't love me anymore. And she's thinking to herself, my husband just doesn't get it. I'm just like exhausted, and he wants to make more kids with me. I can't do this anymore, right? So what needs to happen in that situation? You both need to figure out what the other one needs to feel loved. So, husband, what do you do in that circumstance? You come home. You see your frazzled wife. You say to your wife, honey, go take a nap. You take your children out of the house where she can't even hear them. You take them on a drive. You take them to the park. Give her an hour to sleep. Bring the kids home. She's now refreshed. Make dinner together. Put the kids down together, and then have a nice, rational conversation over a cup of coffee. And now your wife feels like she's being loved. And now she's in a place where she feels she can give you some affection. You see that? They're both trying to love each other, but in a way the other one can't feel. So here's just a little practical recommendation for all you married men out there. Every year on your anniversary, ask your wife a simple question. Honey, what do you need from me to feel loved by me? Just tell me. She might not even know the answer to that yet, but have her pray about it, think about it, and come back and tell you when she feels some certitude about that. And then she should ask the same question from you. Huh? And do that, recalibrate, so to speak, because, like I said, very often your needs for love are unmatched and you don't even know it. Imperceptibly they change, And that's part of justice. Figuring out what good the other person really needs rather than what you want to give them. When you go to the supermarket and you pay for beer, are you happy when they give you milk? I paid for beer. Why are you giving me milk? This is your marriage. Right? So each of you have to figure out in justice kind of what does the other person need, what is due from me. You see that? That's a little tangent, but important, huh? Okay, that's enough about justice, I think. Let's move on to fortitude. Huh? Another word for fortitude is courage. Huh? And that's, of all the virtues, the most manly when you think about it. Like, okay. Temperance and fortitude both have to do with the preservation of life. Okay? Fortitude is about preserving life against dangers. wild animals and military incursions and things like that, right? And temperance is about preserving life, your own bodily life with regard to nutrition, the life of the species with regard to sex and reproduction, huh? So these are the virtues that touch on human life most intimately, huh? And the object of fortitude is a fearful thing, and in particular, dangers that are where death is a possibility, where it's something you're making a choice about. So think the obvious object of fortitude, like the thing that makes for real courage in its first sense, is a soldier on the battlefield in a life and death situation, right? That's where courage comes up more than anything else, huh? And not everyone faces this, but as some people here have been in the military, I'm sure there's a number of you who have been, you may have been put in that situation, right? And that tests your courage, it really is a test of courage, huh? And there are also kind of lesser forms in which there are other dangers, at least danger of bodily harm, danger of some other evil befalling you, right? That in some way also are expressions of courage or fortitude, huh? One thing I've noticed is that a woman really begins to respect a man when she sees him willing to expose himself to danger to protect her. Okay? I'll tell you an interesting story about my parents when they first were dating. Okay? My mom and dad had a very interesting relationship. My mom was not a typical woman that you would expect to see someone dating. My dad was a big football player. He was about 6'6". He played tight end. And my mom was in a wheelchair and mute. She could not talk. It tells you something about my dad. My dad was never the sort of person who judged a book by its cover, huh? They met at UCLA together. And the funny story was that my mom had this electric wheelchair. And in those days, the hills at Westwood, she was trying to get her electric wheelchair up the hill. And my dad thought he'd impress her, and he picked her and the wheelchair up and ran up to the top of the hill and put her down and got a hernia. She was duly impressed. Anyway, shortly after that, they got engaged. And my dad tells me a story. They went out to a movie one time in Old Town Pasadena. In those days, Old Town Pasadena was not regentrified the way it is today. It was a dump because my parents were poor. So they went to the cheap movie theater, huh? And my dad said they came out of the movie theater and they're going down a dark alley. And like this gang of 3 guys basically said, leave your wallet on the lady's lap and walk away. And my dad said some words that were not appropriate to repeat in this context, and which amounted to the answer no. And my mom was drinking Coke from one of those glass Coke bottles, and she took the bottle, smashed it on her wheelchair, and she's like, so the guys went away, That was the thing that my mom always was like, this man was willing to fight for me, right? There's something about courage that really makes a woman feel like, okay, this is my man, Kind of conversely, a man really learns to respect a woman, I think more than anywhere else, when he sees the suffering that she goes through to give life to his child. Oh, you men out there who watched your wife go through labor and give birth to a child, and then the attendant difficulties after giving birth and caring for the little child and everything like that. That's when a man really learns to respect a woman and say, like, that's something I can't do. I'm impressed. I'm deeply impressed with that. Huh? Which is why, by the way, you can see the lie of abortion. Right? Today, feminists say, for men to respect us, we need abortion, because that way we can be equal to men and we can do the same things men do, right? So here's my problem with feminism, okay, just in a nutshell. The first principle of feminism is that men are better than women, because all the feminists say we need to be more like men. Something wrong with that? Stupid. That's not the right. Men and women have different virtues. And women have virtues men don't have, and men have virtues women don't have, and we have to work together, and we're better together that way, huh? So when a woman decides, well, I'm going to try and become like a man, and then instead of suffering to give life to his child, she destroys that life, right? Not only does a man not respect the woman, he starts to lack respect for her. He starts treating her like chattel. And that's what happens. Men go around and they're like, well, I can just have sex with whoever I want, as often as I want, and under any circumstances, because she can just get an abortion. So now a woman just becomes an object of sexual desire, and that's it. It's this failure in our society to understand what really amounts to true justice, true respect, huh? So, all right, back to fortitude then. One thing that fortitude moderates, or a better word is kind of bucks up, is emotions associated with fear. Huh? Fortitude or courage gives us, it's a habit of confronting our fears and overcoming them. Huh? So all of us have things that we're afraid of, right? And then if you're a brave man, what you do is you confront your fears. You don't let the fear control you, you control the fear. And for most people, the tendency is something's frightening or dangerous, and the tendency is to back away, right? And what do we need? A virtue that strengthens us, kind of bucks us up. Think of a rider on a horse, and he wants the horse to charge. Fortitude is like the spurs in the side of the horse that says, go. Fortitude is that habit that prods you and your emotions and says, face that fear, confront that fear, overcome that danger, okay? But there are extremes even in fortitude. The one extreme is cowardice, and almost everyone is more inclined towards cowardice than the other extreme. But the other extreme is recklessness. And there is such a thing as recklessness. There's some people that have a tendency just by, temperamental inclination, they have a tendency towards recklessness. Huh? I had a cousin who I think kind of fell in that category. And one time we were driving somewhere together. He was driving and I was in the passenger seat, and we're driving onto the freeway and kind of merging, and he's like, watch this. And there's a guy right equal to him, and he just like swerves in to cut the guy off. And I'm like, oh, I'm not sure that was the right thing to do, kind of that reckless behavior, right? There's a tendency towards, doing things that are dangerous for no good reason, right? And so some people do have that tendency, and if that's you, okay, I got to back off, huh? Conversely, however, there's cowardice, and that's the one that most people have to struggle with. And so for most people, we try to aim a little bit towards recklessness instead of, the other way, okay? One way to grow in fortitude or courage is to begin by confronting your smaller fears and overcoming those, the smaller dangers or difficulties. And then to grow, right? To keep on increasing, confront larger fears, right? Things that are more difficult to confront. And eventually, by repeated intense acts where you're confronting and facing your fears and overcoming them, maybe it might be a fear of public speaking. Maybe it might be, a fear of, making a mistake at work or whatever, right? But eventually you kind of confront those fears and overcome them, and you grow towards perfect courage. Huh? Finally, remember, fortitude is not about winning a fight. It's about preserving the common good, okay? So if you and someone else have a disagreement about something, you're not brave if you just go and beat them up just to win the fight. If they're in the right and you're in the wrong, you winning the fight isn't brave. You see that? Fortitude is about what does a common good demand? What's the common good of our family demand? What does the common good of society demand? And then putting yourself at the service of that common good, even to the point of being willing to sacrifice your own private interests, even your own life if necessary, right? For the sake of preserving that good. Does that make sense? So therefore, it's important to see it's not just about winning. In fact, maybe the guy who loses the fight is braver than the guy who wins it. You know a great depiction of that? You remember the first Captain America movie? I don't know if any of you saw that Captain America movie that first came out. He was a scrawny little guy, and he always get beat up in alleys, you know. And he just wasn't the strongest guy, but he had the biggest heart. And the guy would just keep beating up. He's like, I can do this all day. That was his line, you know, I can do this all day. You can just keep beating me up, right? He wasn't the guy who won, but he had the most bravery. You see that? So that's a little bit about fortitude. Now finally about temperance, huh? What's the object of temperance? Well, I told you the object of fortitude was dangers, especially the kind of danger in a voluntary, where there possibly a voluntary death, you know, that you could risk your life. The object of temperance is pleasures that have to do with the association, that are associated with the preservation of your individual life and the good of our species. So the pleasures having to do with food, drink, and sex. Those are the things that temperance regulates or moderates, huh? And in particular, it's the sense of touch that needs to be, the pleasures associated with the sense of touch more than anything else that need to be moderated, okay? That's obvious with sex, right? That's the pleasures there are pleasures of the sense of touch, huh? But also with food, you might think, oh, it's taste, you know, food tastes so good or it smells good. No, primarily, it's about the sense of touch. There's a famous story Aristotle tells about this guy named Sarandapalus, who said he prayed for a gullet as long as a stork. He was a famous glutton. He just wanted to feel the food go down, right? And you notice people who are gluttons, they actually don't really enjoy the taste of their food. They just want to, they like inhale it. It's almost like they don't even bother tasting their food. Isn't that interesting? So gluttons tend to be people that are just, they just like the feel of the food going down, okay? So even with regard to temperance, with regard to food, it's primarily a matter of the sense of touch. So that's helpful to know, like, oh, okay, here's what I'm trying to regulate here, okay, or moderate. Now, in some way, temperance is the opposite of fortitude. Remember I told you, what does fortitude do? It bucks you up to confront something that you have a tendency to back off from. Temperance is the opposite. For most people, almost all people, the tendency is to excessively pursue pleasure. So what do you have to do with temperance? You have to pull back and moderate your excessive tendency to pursue pleasure, which is the opposite of the tendency to back away from danger. You see that? And so really there's a kind of a moderating that has to happen with regard to the virtue of temperance. And I compare it to a guy riding a horse, and now he's using the reins to slow the horse down. So imagine your horse is like your sense desires, your sense appetite. And if there's something dangerous, you use your spurs to make him charge. If there's something pleasurable, you use your reins to pull him back. You see that? That's basically temperance and fortitude in a nutshell. Temperance, reins, fortitude, spurs. Does that make sense? Just think of it that way, and that'll really help you with regard to, here's how we deal with these things. Huh? There are extremes on either side. Gluttony is the extreme with regard to food. Lust is the extreme with regard to sex. Huh? With regard to the other extreme, almost no one has it. But Aristotle says, well, a few people, you might call it insensibility. Someone who just like, I mean, today we would say, oh, he or she's got anorexia. They don't want to eat any food at all. Or someone who just, you know, they're very prudish and they don't want anything to do with the pleasures of sex at all, even though they're married and should, you know. So there are extremes, but almost everyone, because of human nature, is inclined towards gluttony and lust, those extremes. Therefore, in temperance, how do I find the mean? I aim for what's on the other side of that extreme. Aim for something that seems like it's a little bit insensible, right? Less pleasure than you think you should have. Less pleasure than you think you should pursue. That's part of bending the tree back so that it'll be upright, okay? So when you're eating, for example, simple thing. Stop eating while you're still a little hungry. Our tendency is almost always to eat until we're not hungry. You see that? If you want to be temperate, eat and stop eating while you're still a little hungry. Okay? And with regard to sex, have sex only in reasonable circumstances. Don't engage in sex, with your wife whenever you feel like it, but say no to yourself sometimes and pull back and okay, do I really need to have sex now? I mean, if she asks for it, she has the right, and therefore don't deny your wife if she asks. But if it's on your side, right, taking initiative, don't always do that. St. Paul recommends abstain from marital relations for a time for the sake of prayer sometimes, right? So as a religious, because I'm living by way of the infused virtues, not just the virtues of nature, natural temperance, I abstain from sex altogether, right? Why? Not because I think there's anything wrong with sex, quite to the contrary, I think it's a really good thing, but because I want to leave myself open for a greater good, which is union with God, and in particular as a priest, the offering of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. So that's not by natural reason, though. Aristotle would look at me and say, well, I don't know what your principle is, but that's not the same thing as the temperance I'm talking about. What I'm doing as a priest and as a religious has to do with a supernatural motivation, and therefore it's a higher virtue, right? But for most people who are in marriage, you need to moderate those desires, but at the same time do them reasonably. Finally, temperance is a foundational virtue for family life. Sex is never a private matter. You might think, I'm just looking at pornography on my phone and no one knows. It will affect your relationships with your wife and your other family members. It does. A lot of people don't understand that. I had the good fortune of growing up before the internet existed, as many of you probably also did. And when I joined the Abbey, the internet had just started. So thanks be to God, I never had to deal with the problems that young people have to deal with today with regard to the internet, right? I came into the Abbey, I didn't even have any access to the internet for my first 7 years at the Abbey, and by that time I'm a completely formed man, and so no problem. It's nice, it's a good grace. When I was a kid, if you wanted to look at pornography, you had to go to a dirty bookstore, and I would not be caught dead in a place like that, Believe me, if someone had just left it under my bed, I probably would have looked. I was a teenager like anyone else. But thanks be to God, that wasn't an option for me, right? But now it is. So 2 pieces of advice for that. Number 1, young people who are struggling with that. Believe it or not, you don't need the internet in your pocket at all times. Believe it or not, you can actually live without the internet, right? Young people have a hard time believing that. When sometimes I'm in confession and someone says, well, I need my smartphone. And I'm like, They're like, what are you, calling 1994? What do you do? What do you use that for, right? And I show them, I don't have the internet. And that's not because I'm worried about me. It's because I want to be a witness to you. I want to prove to everyone you can live in the modern world without constantly having access to the internet. I do have access to the internet. We have a computer room at the Abbey. It's a public place where everyone can see you if you're using the computer. And I go down there. For example, today I had to figure out how to get here. I printed out a map and I put it in my car. And as I was driving down the 110, the off-ramp for the street was closed. So I had to kind of use my wits and actually drive around until I found the place. Surprise, surprise, it's still possible to actually know where north, east, west, and south are without your phone, right? So the point is, it's inconvenient, but what did Jesus say? If your right eye offends you, pluck it out. If your iPhone offends you, throw it away, get a flip phone, okay? It's my advice for young people. Just get rid of the stuff and, you believe it or not, you can live your life perfectly well. I travel internationally and give talks and retreats. I go everywhere, and I don't need a smartphone, okay? So there's for young people if you're struggling with that. For you older people, dads that have little kids and things like that, I'll give you a little inside information. When I hear confessions of young people, especially boys, and they confess that they've been looking at impure images, say, how old were you when you first started looking at that? You know about the average age I hear? 9. 9 years old, they start looking. Most parents don't even bother kind of trying to check on that sort of thing till their kids are 12, 13, 14. You're already 3, 4 years too late, right? You guys have to be super vigilant. Here's the problem. You older people, you from my generation, you did not grow up with the internet, so you have no idea it's phishing for your kids. You have no idea it's phishing for your kids, okay? So you have to be super vigilant, hyper vigilant about those things, okay? Make sure everything's locked down. And talk to your kids regularly and say, hey, sir, what's going on here? If you had any problems, if anything comes up, let me know and let's talk. If you find out your kid's been looking at impure images, whatever you do, don't do this. I am so ashamed of you. That'll be the last time he ever talks to you about that. Instead say, son, I'm so sorry I didn't protect you. Let's talk through this and let's see how we can help you. And let your kid feel that you're there to help them and not to condemn them, okay? It's a really important thing. Because, look, what do you do when you get married? You give to your wife the right over your body for acts apt to generate children. You can't give what you don't have. If you're not a master of your own power of reproduction, then your slave is going to be your wife. And that's not going to be great for her, not a great experience for her. And another thing that happens when you look at impure images, you tend to treat people like furniture. They actually did studies. They showed people pornography in an MRI. I don't recommend such a thing, but they did it. And they said that they process the images in the same place of the brain where people process furniture, okay? I've had more than one occasion a young man come to me and say, I don't know, Father, but since I've been looking at pornography, I have a hard time being compassionate and feeling empathy for people. It destroys your capacity for empathy. That really harms your marriage and your relationship with your kids, right? So those are all some things to realize. You don't realize that there's no such thing as a private sexual sin. Temperance is by its nature a public virtue. So those are just a few things to kind of help you be motivated to really pursue these wonderful virtues. They are beautiful lights. When you have the virtue of temperance, chastity in your soul, it's like you're carrying a light within you at all times. It's a beautiful thing to be a pure soul. And conversely, when you find yourself habitually falling into impurity, you're constantly depressed, right? It's really true. There's a huge difference between a chaste and pure soul and one that's constantly falling into impurity. In one case, you're just weighed down and depressed. The other case, it's like there's a light you carry around in your soul. So it's really important, all these virtues to develop. Begins with temperance, move to fortitude, then to justice eventually. Hopefully, all of you one day will be prudent and wise and virtuous fathers, husbands, and men. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Saint Joseph, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.